So initially I'd hoped to leave this video until I had sent off for my Irish passport, but as it's taken a little bit longer than I hoped for, I figured now is as good a time as any to look at the Irish tanks I would like to see added to War Thunder. This episode will deal purely with the actual tanks used by Ireland, with a future episode to cover the various armoured cars used by Ireland, and honestly, I think you could get a small sub-tree out of the various Irish tanks and armoured cars, though I could also see some of these being added as premium or event vehicles as well. Like with the other Irish vehicles already in the game, like the Leola Corvette and the Vickers Mark 11, which is based on the Irish Timone APC, these would probably be added to the British tech tree, but they could also fit into other tech trees if required. So for the first two tanks we will be looking at the Vickers Medium Mark D and the Landsverk L60, with tanks of these two designs being brought by Ireland in the interwar period, and were the only tanks Ireland had available for the interwar and World War II period. So starting with the Vickers Medium Mark D, this was a one-off design, which was essentially an offshoot of the Vickers Medium Mark II, and of which only one example was produced, which was the one that went to Ireland. Like with the Vickers Medium Mark II, it is very lightly armoured, with the armour maxing out at 8mm thick. So useless against almost any incoming fire, including heavy caliber machine guns and possibly even lower caliber machine guns. And due to being built in the 1920s, it unfortunately doesn't have the best speed, maxing out at around 20 miles per hour or 32 kilometers an hour, while having a crew of 5. Moving on to the main armament, the gun was a bit of a mixed bag, as it was a quick-firing 57mm 6-pounder gun, though not to be confused with the later quick-firing 57mm 6-pounder gun of World War II fame. I haven't been able to find any concrete penetration figures for against tanks or armour, but comparing it to the 3-pounder on the Vickers independent tanking game, it should have a slightly lower muzzle velocity, at 554 metres a second versus 563 metres a second for the 3-pounder. So we are likely looking at a gun that will do around 30 to 35mm penetration at 500 metres, which isn't great to be honest, though not the worst penetration figure in the world either. In addition to this, it also had 4 7.7mm machine guns at various points around the tank, which will help against unarmoured vehicles, but probably isn't going to change your odds of success too much. When introduced into Irish service, it was used to give troops a chance to train on how to operate and work alongside tanks. Though, as you might guess, as it was literally the only tank in Ireland at the time, it would have been of limited use, and would probably have been easily outmatched in combat. Though unfortunately the tank was destroyed in an accident in 1940, so it wouldn't have had a chance to prove itself anyway. In game, I would suggest placing it at a battle rating of 1.0 or possibly lower, like with my suggested battle rating system for World War I and interwar tanks that I covered in a previous episode. And while not the best tank in the world, I think it would mark a good start for an Irish subtree, or just act as a decent Irish tank in general at the very early battle ratings. A few years after acquiring the Mark D, Ireland would be interested in acquiring more tanks, this time the Swedish Landsverk L60, of which 2 would be brought and shipped to Ireland, bringing the total tank force to 3 tanks, with the more modern L60s being far more mobile and versatile than the rather outdated and slow Mark D. Like with the Mark D, these would be used to train troops, and they survived in service until 1968, giving a whopping 34 years of service, and both examples survive to this day. Now, this tank is already in War Thunder in the Swedish tech tree under the name STRV M38 at battle rating 1.0, but there are some differences compared to the examples acquired by Ireland, as the Irish tanks were equipped with a 20mm Madsen cannon instead of the 37mm Bofors gun. This gives a much faster firing rate but less penetration, with the 20mm Madsen cannons having a penetration of 25mm at 175 metres, compared to the 37mm Bofors guns, 55mm penetration at 100 metres. The rest of the stats and battle rating would be the same, so a maximum armour of 13 to 15mm, a top speed of 47 km an hour or 29 miles per hour, and a crew of 3 at a battle rating of 1.0. This would be a good upgrade from the Vickers Medium Mark D, giving Irish players a much more mobile vehicle with a much faster firing weapon, and just generally making a very good upgrade from the slow and less well armed Mark D. By the outbreak of World War II, Ireland only had the 3 tanks that we've covered with which to defend itself. And as mentioned at the beginning, this was quickly reduced to just the 2 L60s when the Vickers Medium Mark D was destroyed in an accident in 1940. Though again, it's very hard to imagine this rather old and outdated tank being useful against a modern enemy, so this probably wasn't such a huge loss on that front. Ireland did acquire Bren carriers and standard Beaverette armoured cars to complement its tank and armoured car forces, but these still would have been inadequate to defend Ireland's neutrality in the event of an invasion. Due to the war, Ireland wasn't able to acquire any more tanks, but in the post-war period, it rented 4 Churchill Mark 6s, these being labelled 1A, 1B, 1C and 1D, with all 4 of these arriving by 1949, and later being brought outright in 1954. For the most part, there was very little change to these tanks, with even the paint scheme being kept the same, as there was a stipulation when they were being rented that they would be returned to Britain immediately if required, so they were basically banned from making any changes to them, though of course this would change once they were bought. However, one of these tanks would later get stuck at the training ground where they would conduct gunnery tests, and basically Ireland didn't have any heavy equipment with which to remove it. And so what they did instead was just remove the gun and return it to the tank whenever they had to do gunnery tests. And eventually, when it was decommissioned in 1967, instead of recovering the tank, they decided to simply bury it. Though it was finally recovered in 2003, and now stands in Dunmore Park in Belfast. The rest of the tanks were retired in 1969, primarily due to a lack of parts and the arrival of the more modern Comet tanks. Unfortunately, the Churchill Mark 6s are not currently in War Thunder, so this would need to be produced by Gaijin, but essentially it is a slight upgrade from the previous Churchill Mark 4s, being armed with the quick-firing 75mm gun, a new cupola and applique armour fitted to the hull sides, so this shouldn't be too difficult a tank to implement in War Thunder. However, a lack of spares for the original engines for the Mark 6 would result in a rather unique variant of the Churchill tank, as it was proposed to replace the original 350 horsepower Bedford engines with the 600 horsepower Rolls-Royce Merlin engines from the Supermarine Sea Firefighters, which were used by Ireland at the time. Tests were conducted with one of the new engines fitted to one of the tanks, but for whatever reason this would not be adopted for the rest of the Mark 6s. But of course in War Thunder this variant could be added as an interesting event vehicle, giving us a Churchill with much better acceleration and potentially a greater top speed, which would help to fix the major issue of the Churchill tanks, which is its slow speed, and giving Ireland a rather unique and powerful variant of the Churchill tank, and like I say, it just would be a rather unique tank in general. After the Churchill Mark 6s, the next major tank adopted by Ireland would be the A34 Comet, with 8 of these entering service by 1960. This was a much more modern and mobile vehicle than the ponderous Churchill tanks, and again there were no major changes undertaken to these tanks, so they would operate much like the Comets already in the British tech tree at battle rating 5.3. However, there would be one major variant that would come about due to an accident destroying the turret of one of the Comets, as while the turret was destroyed, the hull was intact, leading to the installation of a borrowed 90mm recoilless rifle on the turret ring. This allowed a 360-degree arc of fire, though extra armour had to be installed around areas leading to the driver and bow machine gun positions, to mitigate against the effects of backblast when firing the weapon. Unfortunately, the turret itself is now completely exposed, leaving the gunner vulnerable to enemy fire, especially from the air. The 90mm recoilless rifle, however, would be an extremely effective weapon, which, depending on the source used, has a penetration of at least 330 to 380mm when firing heat shells, which is a pretty damn good performance and far superior to the Comet's original gun. Unfortunately, in real life, this modification would not be permanent, and the recoilless rifle was uninstalled and returned to infantry service. But in War Thunder this could make a highly mobile and effective tank destroyer, able to quickly traverse the battlefield before unleashing devastating fire from its new main weapon. Its only downside is the exposed fighting compartment, making it especially vulnerable to enemy aircraft and ground machine gun fire. Perhaps a new feature for this tank would be to give the player the ability for the gunner or other gun crew to duck inside the hull when not in combat, which would help to improve protection when not in combat, and could be offset by giving a delay for remanning the main weapon, but I suspect such a feature would not be added. As for the battle rating, I think this could go at around 6.0 or 6.3, where its gun wouldn't be too overpowered and it would still be able to deal with most enemies. And in general, I think this would be a rather unique and pretty cool vehicle to have available for Irish players. Last but not least, we come to the FV-101 Scorpion, which was a British light tank of which 14 were acquired by Ireland in the 1980s. I have covered this tank in a previous episode on British light tanks, and for the most part very few changes have been made to the Irish variants, with the main weapon still being a 76mm gun, firing a HESH shell with 80 to 90mm penetration, as well as smoke, shrapnel, HE and illumination shells. It also has a coaxial 7.62mm machine gun, a crew of 3, extremely light armour and a ridiculous top speed of 45 miles per hour or 72 kilometers an hour, which also means it holds the world record for the fastest production tank. However, there is one noticeable change to the Irish variant in that it can carry a machine gun on the roof, which initially was a 50 cal Browning machine gun, though this was later changed to a 7.62mm GPMG machine gun, mainly due to the large silhouette of the 50 cal weapon. This could perhaps be added as a vehicle modification, allowing you to switch between the two weapons, or maybe remove them entirely to aid in concealment. Like with the British Scorpion tank, I would suggest adding this at a battle rating of around 6.0, mainly on account of its HESH shell, because while the HESH shell only has 80 to 90mm penetration, this is not affected by sloping, so you could still take out T-34s and Panther tanks relatively easily, but more heavily armoured tanks would be mostly immune against the Scorpion tank. So I think battle rating 6.0 would be a fairly good place for it to go, though its battle rating could be lowered or raised as required. So that is all of the various Irish tanks I think should be added to War Thunder. I think out of all of these, the Headless Coachman or the Churchill Mark VI with the Merlin engine are probably the ones I'd be looking forward to the most, as these are rather cool and unique variants that we can't really get in other tech trees, and I think they would be a major boon to War Thunder in general. Today we'll be looking at the various Irish armoured cars I'd like to see added to War Thunder, with these ranging from relatively simple designs from the interwar period all the way to the cutting edge vehicles of the Cold War and modern era. So Ireland had first started using armoured cars pretty much all the way back to its inception, or at least the Irish Civil War, and this started with the Rolls-Royce armoured car. But unfortunately these early designs were armed solely with machine guns, which makes them rather unsuitable to be added to War Thunder. So we will actually be starting with the Leyland armoured car, also referred to as the Armoured Vehicle ALV-1 or Leyland ALV-1, which came about during the 1930s as Ireland looked at replacing some of its earlier armoured cars like the Peerless. Unfortunately, the budget for this work was limited, which meant having to reuse the armour plate and twin turrets from the now obsolete Peerless armoured car in order to keep the costs down. The old turrets and armour were fitted to a Leyland Terrier TE2 lorry chassis, which despite being a civilian design had been produced to specifications laid out by the British War Office, meaning it was designed to be used in areas with poor roads and limited access to maintenance facilities, which gave it an advantage over other civilian designs. The first vehicle was finished in September 1934, but due to issues with the twin turrets from the Peerless, it was decided to try and acquire an alternative turret, which led to the purchase and fitting of 4 turrets from the Landsverk L60 light tank, which was a Swedish light tank of which 2 were already in service in Ireland. This gave the Leyland a much better armament compared to the previous twin turret configuration, which had only had machine guns, while the new L60 turrets allowed the installation of a 20mm Madsen cannon, which had a penetration of 32mm at 500 metres, which is a pretty decent performance for a 1930s armoured car. Plus it still had the coaxial machine gun, so it didn't really lose anything here. So this was just an overall gain for the vehicle. The turret also had the advantage of slightly improving the overall protection of the vehicle, as the turret had a maximum armour thickness of 15mm for the mantlet and 13mm for the rest of the turret. which compares to only 8mm for the whole of the vehicle itself, which isn't really even able to stop heavy or even potentially light caliber machine guns, and does make the 4-man crew somewhat vulnerable to hull penetrations. The Leyland would go on to serve all throughout the war and would be upgraded in the 1950s, which included the replacement of its coaxial Madsen machine gun with a Browning machine gun plus another one being fitted in the hull, as well as remodelling of the frontal hull to be more like the Swedish Landsverk L180, which was also in Irish service. But more importantly, it was fitted with a Ford V8 engine, which gave the vehicle a top speed of 45 miles per hour or 72 kilometers an hour. In this form, the Leylands would survive in service until the 1980s, rendering nearly 50 years of service. When added to War Thunder, I think both the original and refit models could be added at Tier 1, battle rating 1.0 or possibly even 1.3, and due to their fast speed and decent armament, I think they could be a really useful addition for an Irish subtree. On a quick side note, Ireland did attempt a similar concept to the Leyland with the Dodge Mark 7 and Mark 8, with these being based on the Dodge TF37 truck chassis, though only the Mark 7 actually had any anti-tank weaponry, and this was in the form of the 20mm Madsen. Only 5 of these were built in both variants, and they served from the early 1940s till the early 1960s, and don't seem to have been as successful as the Leyland design. And the Dodge Mark 7 is basically very similar to the Leyland, so like I said, it has the same armament, same speed, crew complement and protection. So this would probably be surplus to requirements for an Irish subtree, but it could still be added as a unique premium or event vehicle, again battle rating 1.0 or 1.3, or possibly even folded with the Leyland to help bolster Irish lineups. But while the Leyland armoured cars were successful and had a long service life, it had taken from March 1934 to July 1939 to build all 4 vehicles, which was clearly an unacceptable rate of production. Thus, for the next armoured cars, it was decided to buy some off-the-shelf vehicles, leading to Ireland ordering a number of Landsverk L180 armoured cars, which is a vehicle we have covered many times on this channel, due to its being sold to many different nations in many different configurations. In Ireland's case, it was armed with the 20mm Madsen cannon, capable of penetrating 32mm of armour at 500 metres, and 2 Madsen machine guns, one in a coaxial position and one in the bow, while the armour maxed out at around 15mm for the turret mantlet and 9mm for the hull. With regards to speed, it could reach a top speed of 50 miles per hour or 80 kilometers an hour, and it had a crew of 5, which included a front and rear driver, gunner, commander and loader. Ireland would order 8 of these vehicles before World War II, and would go on to order a further 5 in 1939. But due to the outbreak of World War II, this order would be kept in Sweden, and instead used by the Swedish Army. And this was especially problematic because a large quantity of spare parts had been included in this order, and so maintenance would become much harder in the coming years. This also probably explains why Ireland commenced production on the Dodge Mark 7 and Mark 8, because they had to make up for the shortfall in L180s. The L180s would serve throughout World War II, and much like with the Leylands, the L180s would go on to have a long service life after the war, and again would receive many upgrades, such as new radios, Ford V8 engines, and Browning machine guns to replace the Madsen machine guns. Interestingly, unlike the Leylands, in the 1970s, 2 of the L180s would get a new main armament, with the 20mm Madsen cannon replaced with a 20mm Hispano Suiza taken from the now scrapped de Havilland Vampire fighters. These 20mm cannons would have a penetration of around 25mm at 500 metres when firing APT shells, which is less than the 20mm Madsen cannon, but this is offset by a faster rate of fire, albeit this would mean chewing through your ammo extremely quickly. As for the Ford engines, I believe they would give about the same speed as on the Leyland armoured cars, so about 45 miles per hour or 72 kilometers an hour, which is still pretty speedy if a little slower than before. When added to War Thunder, I could see the L180 being added at battle rating 1.3 just after the Leylands, while the upgraded variant could either be an event vehicle or folded with the L180s, with both variants able to quickly get around the battlefield and hit enemies with hard-hitting or fast-firing weapons, depending on the variant used. And it would be nice to see the L180 finally added to War Thunder, especially considering how many nations used it. So unfortunately, that's it for the World War II armoured cars, and while we do have some very decent vehicles here, They are only really suited for tier 1 and are all quite similar to each other in regards to stats. But moving on to the Cold War period, we now get a whole slew of modern designs. Mostly foreign built vehicles, but there are a few domestically produced vehicles that could be introduced, with these being produced by the Timony company and designed by Seamus Timony, who was an engineer who worked at Alvis in Britain, that company of course producing the Alvis, Saladin and Saracen armoured cars. The first of these domestic vehicles is the Timony Armoured Reconnaissance Vehicle 4x4 Mark I, which was fitted with the same 76mm gun as on the British Scorpion light tank, and this fires a Hess shell with 82 to 90mm penetration and has a crew of 3. Unfortunately, other stats aren't really available, though no doubt it would be a fast but lightly armoured vehicle, and according to some sources, while only 2 of these prototypes were built in Ireland, this vehicle apparently did go into production in Tanzania, though again, sources on this are somewhat scarce. All in all, the ARV Mark I would be a perfectly serviceable vehicle at around battle rating 5.3, especially since its Hess shell ignores the effects of sloping, and so it would happily fill in any tier 3 or 4 gaps in an Irish subtree, while giving a massive upgrade from the previous armoured cars and a different playstyle from the Irish tanks that would be included on the subtree. There is also the Timony APC Mark VI, which was tested with a turret fitted with a 90mm gun, essentially making this an Irish version of the Vickers Mark 11, which was also based on a Timony APC. The 90mm weapon should perform broadly the same as on the French AML 90, so 320mm penetration with Heat FS shells. It had a top speed of 65 mph or 105 km/h, but this was without the turret, so no doubt some speed would be lost, while the armour thickness would be extremely light, making it vulnerable to enemy fire. Its original crew without the turret was 2, though I believe it should be around 3 with the turret, though 10 soldiers could also be carried, allowing the crew to be bumped up as required. This seems to be a decent vehicle for around battle rating 7.0 to 7.6, giving Irish players a far harder hitting vehicle than the ARV Mark I, albeit with some overlap with the AML 90, which would also be available for the Irish subtree. But for players looking to use just domestically produced vehicles, this will probably be preferred to the French vehicle. Unfortunately, most Timony armoured vehicles generally weren't fitted with anti-tank weapons outside of tests and prototypes, so there are limited domestic options other than the 2 we just looked at. Thankfully, Ireland also used many foreign designs, giving us a wide variety of foreign vehicles that could be added to an Irish subtree. To start off this list of foreign vehicles, we have the French Panhard AML 60, which started off as the AML 67 CS, which was armed with a 60mm CS mortar, but this was later changed to a 60mm HB mortar. Despite being a mortar, it could be used in the direct fire role, and the HB mortar was able to fire both heat and APFS DS rounds, with the heat round able to penetrate 200mm of armour, and the APFS DS round able to penetrate 20mm of armour at a 45-degree angle at 1000 metres, making this a surprisingly decent vehicle for anti-tank work, especially when using the heat round, though the APFS DS round may struggle a little bit. Also, as this is a mortar weapon, it does have an elevation of -15 to +80 degrees, meaning that a skilled player can use this weapon in the indirect fire role, potentially catching some players off guard, or allowing the bombardment of choke points or enemies behind cover. Other than that, it has a pretty good top speed of 56 mph or 90 km/h, a crew of 3 and a maximum armour thickness of 12mm, so definitely more suited to the reconnaissance and ambush role. As for the battle rating, I would suggest placing it at around battle rating 5.3 or 5.7, as its heat shell would have the same penetration as the Soviet PT-76 at 5.3, though the APFS DS round might struggle a bit, so maybe just having the heat round available could be a way around this. Like with the previous armoured cars, the AML 60s would be upgraded, and have experiments carried out on them over the years, with the vehicles eventually becoming the Panhard AML 20, which involved the replacement of the old petrol engine with a Peugeot diesel engine, the addition of a new GI2 20mm cannon to replace the 60mm mortar, and the introduction of an upgraded fire control system, which included a laser rangefinder. Unfortunately, it would be hard to take advantage of the laser rangefinder due to the 20mm cannon's anemic performance, being only capable of penetrating around 37mm at 500m with HFAP rounds, meaning players would probably be forced to engage in flanking attacks at close range. Personally, I can't see this vehicle going any higher than 5.3 and possibly even lower, which funnily enough would also make this the lowest ranked vehicle with a laser rangefinder, as we don't see it appearing on other vehicles until rank 5 or battle rating 7.3. Potentially it could be used in conjunction with other vehicles with longer ranged guns, with the AML-20 providing ranging information for these vehicles, but I can't see this being a rewarding strategy for players using the AML-20, so I suspect hit and run attacks would be its main strength. In addition to the GI2 20mm, there were tests conducted with other weaponry, with one AML being fitted with a 25mm Bushmaster, and another fitted with the 30mm Radan cannon as used on the British Scimitar light tank. Both of these weapons have much better penetration than the regular GI2, with the APDS round on the 25mm Bushmaster and 30mm Radan cannon capable of penetrating 74 and 95mm of armour at 500m respectively. These two variants could be added as premium or event vehicles, or potentially even have these weapons available as modifications on the regular AML-20, much like with the recently added TOG-2. These weapon choices would give even more variety to Irish vehicles, allowing players a wide choice of fast-firing weapons, which could all be used on the same chassis, giving players a familiar vehicle to work with. So as you can see, there are many variants to choose from with regards to the AML-60 and AML-20, but for those of you looking for something with a bit more punch, there is thankfully the Panhard AML-90, which is virtually the same as the AML-60 but is fitted with a 90mm gun, and this vehicle is handily already in War Thunder in the French tech tree. However, the Irish variant was upgraded with a new diesel engine and the same fire control system as used on the AML-20, which remember gives it access to a laser rangefinder, which is something the original AML-90 does not have access to, meaning the Irish variant would represent a massive upgrade compared to the French variant. This could result in a slightly higher battle rating from the original AML-90's 7.3 to maybe 7.6, but it would give Ireland a very unique variant of this vehicle to differentiate it from the original French variant, and I can see this being a very successful vehicle in an Irish subtree. So having looked at many Irish armoured cars, both domestic and foreign, we finally come to the Morag Piranha 3H Medium Reconnaissance Vehicle, or MRV, which is a vehicle designed by the Swiss Morag company. In Irish service, the MRV variant is armed with the 30mm ATK Bushmaster 2 Mark 44 cannon, which is already in-game on vehicles like the CV9030 Finn, where it has a penetration of 110mm at 500m with APFS DS rounds, but only 81mm at the same distance with its stock APDS rounds. It also comes with two 7.62mm machine guns, has a crew of 3 consisting of a driver, commander and gunner, though 6 troops can also be carried. I suspect armour protection would be roughly on par with other vehicles of this type, so proof against smaller caliber weapons at a few hundred meters distance, but extremely vulnerable to regular main battle tanks. But thankfully it also has a very high top speed of 62 miles per hour or 100 kilometers an hour, meaning this fast moving vehicle should be able to avoid most heavy enemies and quickly deal with them by attacks on their flanks, as well as still being used in the traditional reconnaissance role, allowing other more heavily armoured vehicles to deal with enemies that you perhaps can't deal with. I could see this going at battle rating 9.0 or higher, and this would be the most modern of the Irish vehicles added to the game. And while it maybe does lack a little in overall hitting power compared to contemporary vehicles with large caliber weapons, I think it would still be a pretty fun vehicle to top out an Irish subtree. So that is all of the Irish armoured cars I would like to see added to War Thunder. So I hope you've enjoyed that episode on Irish armoured cars, but like I say, hopefully you'll join me for the next episode regardless. I've been Terreno, and I'll see you next time.